We have an exciting development to share with you. The Economics and Country Risk podcast and the Maritime and Trade Talk podcast are joining forces to bring you a brand new show, the Decisive podcast. Join our team of seasoned analysts as they explore the ever changing landscape of economics, country risk, maritime trade, and supply chain. Each episode of the Decisive podcast features insights and intelligence that will empower you to make decisions with confidence. Whether you're a business leader, investor, or simply curious about the forces shaping our world, the Decisive Podcast is here to provide you with the knowledge you need to stay ahead. The Decisive Podcast will launch on this feed in June, so if you're already subscribed, you're all set. If you're not, subscribe now so you don't miss our premiere episode of The Decisive, your go-to resource for expert insights and analysis. And now for your episode of Economics and Country Risk. Hello, I'm Kristen Hallam, lead content strategist for Global Intelligence and Analytics at S&P Global Market Intelligence and host of the podcast. In this episode, we're focusing on the recent election results in Mexico and the potential impact on the country's business environment and on the geopolitical landscape. Joining me for this discussion is Jose Enrique Sevilla-Macip, senior analyst for Latin America, and Rafael Amiel, director, Latin American and Caribbean economics. Welcome back to the podcast, Jose Enrique and Rafael. Let's start by quickly recapping the results of the election for our listeners. Jose Enrique, what can you tell us?
Thanks for having me, Kristen. First of all, we need to say that the ruling Morena party won big. Morena won the presidential election with its candidate, Claudia Sheinbaum, with 59% of the vote. That is 32 percentage points ahead of the runner-up. This is not only a big margin, but it's also a wider margin compared to that which AMLO obtained in the 2018 election. Besides the presidency, Morena also won 7 out of 9 state governorships, including Mexico City, and they also won big in Congress. Morena, together with its allies, the Labor Party and the Green Party, obtained above 360 deputies in the lower chamber of Congress. That is enough to pass constitutional majorities. That's a two-thirds majority in the Chamber of Deputies. In the Senate, they fell 2 seats short of a two-thirds majority. They obtained 83 out of 128 Senate seats. Now, certainly this is below the threshold required to approve constitutional amendments, but based on precedents of the past couple of legislative elections in which we've seen elected deputies and senators from other parties to either align with Morena on certain issues or switch parties altogether, we believe that it is likely that the government is going to be able to get these two-thirds majorities either for specific issues of its legislative agenda or perhaps by having a couple of senators to switch sides and, align with Morena entirely. So just as a recap, Morena won the presidency, Morena won the majority of state governorships, and Morena increased its majorities in the federal Congress, including a two-thirds majority in the lower chamber.
Wow, that is a big margin for Sheinbaum and a significant result for Morena overall. So what does this mean for the opposition?
Well, the opposition is in a very difficult place as of now. Mexico's party system at the dawn of the 21st century was composed basically by 3 parties, which were a center party, the former ruling PRA party, a conservative party, the National Action Party or PAN, and on the left wing we had the PRD, the Party of the Democratic Revolution. AMLO hailed from this left-wing party. After the 2012 election, AMLO defected from this party and conformed Morena. And basically, after the election won by AMLO in 2018, it disrupted this traditional three-party system. What we've seen in the 2024 election is the further collapse of the three-party system, and we've got now Morena as a clearly consolidated political force nationwide. And on the opposition, the PRD, AMLO's former party, lost its registry due to very low votes. The PRI got its worst result ever. and the conservative National Action Party also got less than 20% of the votes. So basically, the opposition won't have the coordination nor the numbers in Congress to stop basically any Morena initiative.
So now that Marina has the presidency and the constitutional majority, or, very close to it in the Senate, what is Marina likely to do? What proposals will the party try to push through?
Morena has a quite ambitious constitutional reform agenda. In February this year, just 8 months before leaving office, AMLO announced a set of 18 constitutional amendments that would structurally change the nature of the Mexican state. Among the most important of these proposed reforms include the transfer of the National Guard, which is a militarized police corporation, its administrative transfer to the Defense Ministry. Currently, it is at least legally a civilian corporation. With this reform, it will now be fully and legally a military corporation, which will grant the Defense Ministry a stronger position in the conduction of Mexico's security policy. The second relevant amendment is the so-called judicial reform, which we're going to discuss a bit more afterwards because of its importance and because both AMLO and Sheinbaum have singled this reform out as its first order of business for the new Congress. Another very relevant amendment proposal is that an administrative reorganization of the Mexican state, which contemplates the elimination of several regulatory organs. For example, the Energy Regulatory Organism, the Regulation Agency for the Telecom sector, and the Antitrust Organism. Another institution that would be dismantled under this proposal would also be the Transparency Institute. And the final of these major structural reforms is a change in electoral rules. What Morena is trying to do is to reduce the number of deputies and senators, basically by eliminating proportional representation seats. This would allow the majority party to have even more power in future Congresses. So far, AMLO and Sheinbaum, after discussing which of these proposals they were going to prioritize, they decided to, as of now and within 2024, focus only on the reform of the judiciary. Not because they have discarded the other ones. Probably Sheinbaum is going to go for them, but probably in 2025 or beyond. So far, within 2024, what we are expecting is passage of the reform to the judiciary.
Wow. Well, it sounds like some pretty impactful proposals there. What can you tell us about how these proposals might impact businesses specifically?
Given that Morena is giving priority to the overhaul of the judiciary, perhaps it makes sense to elaborate on that one. Basically, the main change proposed by AMLO in this amendment is to elect Supreme Court magistrates and all federal judges by popular vote, instead of the current system, which the president must nominate judges, and at least in the Supreme Court, they should be approved by the Senate. Under the new rules, this will be an open process for everyone that wants to be a judge can contest for doing so. The process involves the nomination of 10 candidates by the executive, by the president, basically, 10 candidates by the legislative branch, which is 5 by the Chamber of Deputies, 5 by the Senate, and another 10 candidates by the judiciary itself. Mexico Supreme Court currently has 11 seats. The amendment proposed to reduce the number of seats to 9, and then we're going to have these 30 candidates, 10 nominated by the president, 10 by Congress, and 10 by the judiciary. From that pool of 30 candidates, the people are going to vote for 9. Now, what does this mean for the business environment? Well, that we believe that it's going to increase legal risk and particularly legal redress options for companies operating in Mexico. Because if Mexico submits judges and Supreme Court magistrates to popular vote, one can only expect that the results and the composition of the Supreme Court and judicial mechanisms all across Mexico, is likely going to reflect the composition of both Congress and the executive branch, which as of now is, as we've seen, an overwhelming support for Morena. This will open courts to a more overt process of politicization and thus reduce judicial independence. That has been an issue overall in Mexico, historically and under AMLO. But if this reform passes as it is, this process is just only going to accentuate.
Rafael, it might be good to bring you in now to offer some economic perspective on this as well. What might we see in terms of impact to the overall economy?
Thank you, Kristen. Well, what we have seen already, the immediate impact of the election of Mr. Sheinbaum is that the foreign exchange market have reacted negatively, and the Mexican currency, the peso, has depreciated in the 8 to 10% range, depending where you look at. What you start day, you look at the day of the election or a few days before. So the markets are not very happy with exactly what Jose mentioned, the threats of constitutional changes. I say the markets because if you see the bonds market also, Mexican sovereigns in price have declined, so the yield to maturity has increased, not excessively as we have seen on the foreign exchange market, but certainly the reaction to the threat of these changes is is something that we have to take into account because that will translate into business sentiment, and then poor business sentiment translates into lower investment, which in the past 6 years has not been extremely good. So if we have to say the immediate impact of this election, we say, well, until we hear something different, we have to revise our forecast. We have to revise our investment forecast in the private sector and look ahead and say, well, if we don't see any changes in terms of the proposed policy orientation, then the potential for investment and growth in Mexico will diminish significantly.
Well, I want to come back to you on that forecast, but first I just want to talk a little bit about where we might see some policy continuity between Sheinbaum and the outgoing president AMLO.
In terms of policy continuity, in our baseline scenario, we already assume that the excess spending or the increased public investment during the past 4 to 6 quarters that were happening in order to complete flagship projects by the government will decline in 2025. So the expected 5% fiscal deficit of 2024 should decline, and the government will align to this. That's not going to change in terms of the risk of additional spending or in terms of the risk of sharper or equal size increases in minimum wages. Then it's not in our baseline scenario. We're assuming that going forward, public finances will move in the path of fiscal consolidation, reducing the deficit, stabilizing the debt, and then we assume that minimum wages would not increase as much as they did in previous years. So that policy continuity is in our baseline, and we need to wait and see if something different is announced by the new administration. Regarding the stance of the government with respect to the private sector and private investment, I'm going to pass this to Jose Enrique.
Okay, well, Sheinbaum hails from Morena. Sheinbaum has been a very close ally to AMLO, and they are ideologically coincident. So we expect broad policy continuity in most domains. Sheinbaum has endorsed AMLO's approach to the energy sector in the sense of strengthening Pemex in the oil and gas sector and the Federal Electricity Commission in the power sector, strengthen them not only through constant financial support, but also through regulatory changes. Social policy, this has been one of the landmark issues under AMLO, and Sheinbaum has pledged to not only continue AMLO's social spending, but also include some new transfer programs that she enacted during her term as Mexico City mayor, and that she plans for them to become national. Another important aspect that Sheinbaum is likely going to continue is the development focus on Mexico's southern regions in comparison to northern central states, which are already more developed and which already have a significant industrial presence. And finally, another point I want to highlight is foreign policy. Mexico under AMLO has tried to recover this position of non-alignment. Mexico, in strategic issues, remains aligned to the United States, but at least rhetorically, AMLO has tried to shift away and try to brand this non-alignment posture. We expect that to broadly remain under Sheinbaum.
And just thinking about Sheinbaum and AMLO as political leaders, in what way might we see differences between them?
The important aspect because policy-wise, we expect a lot of continuity, but the difference between them is going to be more notable on the style of governing. AMLO, throughout his term, every day he has devoted 2 or 3 hours to give a daily press conference in which he basically lays out his agenda. He criticizes journalists. He comments on Mexican history. He basically shares his thoughts on whatever's going on in Mexico and in the world every day. Sheinbaum, because of her personality, she's more of a technical profile. We don't expect her to continue this style of governing. Also, for example, I just mentioned several issues in which we expect policy continuity, energy, foreign policy, but even within that broad continuity, some style differences are going to be important. On the energy side, for example, Sheinbaum has a trajectory as a scholar in environmental engineering. She has pledged to put more emphasis on renewable power generation. We expect that to be a focus of our energy policy, but within this broader framework of having the state-owned firms playing the main role in this energy policy. So perhaps, yes, more support for renewables, but under a framework privileging state-owned companies. On foreign policy, we expect these, well, relations with the US are going to remain the most important, but we also expect this non-alignment rhetoric, but without the diplomatic confrontations that we've seen under AMLO. Sheinbaum being, as I was saying, a more reserved profile, she's unlikely to be willing to openly comment on international relations during press conferences. So perhaps the broader approach to foreign policy will remain, but this style of confronting ideologically opposing leaders from other countries, we don't expect that from a Sheinbaum presidency.
That's a good segue, I think, into my next question. You talked about AMLO's policy of non-alignment and how the US relationship is among the most important, if not the most important relationship that Mexico has. But could you maybe shed some light on any potential impact that these elections could have on Mexico's relationship with the US, either on specific issues or with other key actors in the region or specific personalities, if you will?
Relation between the US and Mexico currently is centered around three topics: immigration, security, and particularly fentanyl trafficking, and trade and regional supply chains. Under AMLO, we've seen broad alignment with the US on all these three accounts. Again, rhetorically, AMLO has been critical of the US foreign policy in other parts of the world, but AMLO has maintained a 28,000 strong military deployment all over Mexico, focused only on containing illegal immigration flows towards the US. Mexican law enforcement is detaining above 100,000 illegal migrants per month during 2024, preventing them to reach the US border. So, despite all the rhetoric about the need of investing in human development in Central America, AMLO has complied with US demands of Mexico helping to prevent migration flows to reach the border. On fentanyl trafficking, there have been differences regarding how they proceed operationally against drug trafficking organizations, but certainly AMLO has been willing to maintain this cooperation with US strategic objectives. Perhaps the only difference compared to previous Mexican administrations is that AMLO isn't in favor of U.S. operatives working in Mexican territory alongside Mexican law enforcement. We expect Sheinbaum to endorse a similar approach. And finally, on trade, well, Mexico is fully dependent on U.S. for its trade policy. 80% of Mexican exports go to the U.S. The U.S. is the prime foreign investor in Mexico. So, on that regard, well, we expect Mexico to maintain broad policy continuity. What's going to be more interesting is what is the U.S. policy towards Mexico after the U.S. election in November. But that will depend on the results, and I would leave that to our U.S. colleagues to analyze.
Rafael, bringing you back into the discussion, how do you see the outcomes of the elections impacting the economic landscape and investment opportunities for Mexico?
I want to go back a little bit to the exchange rate issue because in our assessment, way before throughout the past 4 quarters, we've been saying that the Mexican peso was overvalued. And this correction, which is still a partial correction, brings values more in line with what should be an equilibrium exchange rate. But certainly, this may help exports and the purchasing power of remittances within the domestic market in Mexico. But it's a correction that is showing that the premium that the peso had is vanishing for the direction of travel that may happen to policy in Mexico. And in our forecast, we assume what we call mild nearshoring. So we assume increased foreign direct investment in Mexico in the next 5 years, but not massive because there are some constraints that we have discussed in previous podcasts. And with this results, what we may have to do is to revise that assumption of mild nearshoring. We have examples of committed investments, sizable committed investments in Mexico that have not materialized yet and may not materialize at all. So that may lead us to revise. We need to still be a little bit patient on what may happen with the administration in terms of these constitutional reforms, what may happen in terms of policy continuity. But in our baseline scenario, we may need to incorporate immediately some of these changes.
Rafael, can you just, for the sake of our listeners, tell them what our current forecast is for Mexico? And I think you've already mentioned some changes that you're considering, but anything that you can share on that would be great.
Sure. As we speak, we are on the process of updating our forecast for the month of June. Our latest forecast calls for Mexico's real GDP to grow 2.4%, and we may revise this downwards by 0.3 of a percentage point, so that would be 2.1%. In the model that we're running for 2025, the reduction on the expansion of real GDP is about 1 to 2 points, so it may come from 2.5 to 2.3%.
Thanks for that. So, question for both of you. What indicators will you be watching as AMLO's term winds down and Sheinbaum prepares to step into the presidency? Jose Enrique, let's start with you, and then we'll go to Rafael.
I can think of basically two broad indicators that are worth monitoring ahead of the Sheinbaum's inauguration on October 1st. The first one is the cabinet appointments. So far, the only confirmed position that Sheinbaum has said is the finance ministry, and she confirmed incumbent finance minister Rogelio Ramirez, which has served for already 3 years. If Sheinbaum announces further cabinet positions that are already in the post, well, that would indicate that AMLO's influence in government decision making is likely going to remain beyond his stepping down. The other major indicator that we believe we should be watching for is investment announcements. Now that we've got a clear picture of the new Congress, of the new president, New investment announcement would significantly increase confidence in Mexico for the next term, or on the other hand, the cancellation of already made investment announcement would point on the other side. No? So I would say those two indicators are worth watching now. The cabinet appointments and anything that happens in relation to investment announcements.
Okay. And how about you, Rafael? What indicators will you be watching?
I will follow closely government spending to check and confirm that our assumption of a correction or a reduction of the fiscal deficit is on its way. And then the other one relates to investment, that from the standpoint that Enrique mentioned before, what is the Sheinbaum expecting from the private sector? So we want to see what the new administration stance is towards big economic decisions. Do they want to concentrate and centralize economic decisions? Will they let more action to the private sector compared to what we already have, right? So those are the two key indicators that I will check.
All right. And any final thoughts for our listeners? Rafael, let's start with you since you're already on the hot seat.
Yeah, I want to call the attention of our audience to Mexico's economic performance in the past 6 years. If our forecast is fully correct, I mean, there's not much room for deviation. We're talking 6 years growth. Mexico's growth in the past 6 years has been 8%. The super growth, there was a pandemic, yes, but for instance, the United States would have completed 17% growth. Brazil, 13% growth. The region, almost 11%. So Mexico has growing at a lower pace than its regional peers, and certainly much, much lower than the United States. And so this investment opportunities that we're talking, the nearshoring or reshoring, those are key elements for Mexico to expand. So we look carefully at that. We continue to discuss this because we don't see much room for growth if investment doesn't happen. And the role of the private sector is very important and relevant in this project.
All right. And Jose Enrique, any final thoughts for our listeners?
Sure, perhaps just adding another indicator to watch out for. I mean, I just mentioned about the importance of Sheinbaum's cabinet nominations, but as a broader indicator, how the relationship between AMLO and Sheinbaum plays out. That's going to be an interesting thing to watch for. AMLO has pledged to fully retire from public life once he steps down. And how will Sheinbaum manage all the different factions within Morena and that so far have been disciplined because of AMLO's leadership? If AMLO's leadership is missing, as he has said he will retire, how will Sheinbaum be able to maintain this unity and discipline within Morena? That's going to be one of the key questions that we're looking forward to answer by the end of this year, hopefully.
All right. Well, thank you, Jose Enrique and Rafael, for sharing your insights with us on Mexico's election results and that impact. That wraps up our episode. Please subscribe to the podcast so you don't miss our episodes on other key elections, including India, South Africa, and the European Union. Until then, stay curious and stay informed.
Thank you for listening to the Economics and Country Risk podcast. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode.